the principle behind small change work is that it's useful always, in my view, at least in my experience, to start with doing something very, very practical and very often very doable, very small. But that's not of any value unless it has strategic value as well. And the question for me in small change is, how do we literally plant a tree out on the pavement in order to provide shade, let's say, a very practical issue, but strategically it's part of an urban environmental awareness program, for example. That's just one example. So that's the principle, doing something quick, something practical, something small, but potentially with enormous strategic value. And that's what, for me, backs into this discussion on governance. And I'm always intrigued in trying to get, whether it's the arts, whether it's social sciences, whoever it might be, engaged politically, but not by taking to the streets with banners, because that's what we used to do in the 60s, and that doesn't kind of work anymore. But by actually getting them engaged with the agenda that politics is bound now to engage with. And there are two things that always come together when we talk about governance. One is efficiency. In other words, we're talking about the need for greater efficiency in the delivery and management of services, utilities, whatever you might call it. And the other is equality, equity. And everybody now knows, in fact, in the international debate these days, we've moved away from talking about income poverty to income inequity. And it's the inequities that are the struggle that most cities are facing currently at the moment. So I kind of look at both equity and efficiency as being the big agenda that governance engages with. Governance, as good governance dialogue, is about looking for new partnerships between the state, the market, and civil society groups. In other words, it's about, unlike some of the neoliberal stuff, it's not about getting government off the hook, as a lot of voluntary work tends to kind of be seeming. It's about bringing government back, but in a different relationship to civil society groups. And that's the big agenda. So, good governance, equity, efficiency, those are the two big agendas. Governance is integral to finding ways that are more efficient and more equitable, which means new forms of partnership. And you can't have new forms of partnership without the whole concept of participation being integral to all of that. Yep. So those are the big things. Now, I've always thought that the arts are a fantastic mediator between practical and strategic work. Give you one example, and as you say, I have many examples, and it's easy to tell lots of stories. In Nepal, for example, in the southern part of Nepal, the floods come every year. And after the floods, the snakes appear. Yeah, and the snakes bite the kids. And the kids go running to the clinics, and there's nobody in the clinic because they're not very well manned, and all sorts of things happen, and goodness knows what. All right. Absolute waste of time trying to teach adults what to do when the snakes come out, because they're not that interested and they're all too busy and so on. So there's a piece of street theatre going on in town, and all the kids are sitting on the pavement, and the theatre group, professional theatre group, is acting out in some wonderfully engaging ways, and the kids are laughing and everybody's having a fantastic time, engaging with what happens when the snakes come, what happens to avoid bites and so on. The practical agenda was to deal with snake bites. Of course, behind the kids, this is in the street, behind the kids are all the adults, they're all looking after their kids and they're learning and so on. The strategic agenda was to bring into the schools an environmental awareness program about floods, and to get children to be part of the governance of place when it comes to floods and dealing with snakes. Yeah? To the extent that children's groups then would go out and teach adults and inform adults what was going on. Yeah? And so we have a children's group as part of the governance of place in managing floods, but at the same time, of course, the environmental awareness program is integrated into the schools and so on and so forth. So for me, the theatre group was mediating in different ways, mediating between that important agenda that is very practical, you're getting bitten by snakes, at the same time very strategic, and that is how do you engage with people in a way that can make sure that these programs are into the schools and into the community and so on. I'll just give you another very, very quick example of where the arts also mediated wonderfully. This was in Kingston, Jamaica, where the presentation, or the representational form was very much in murals, mural design and so on. And we were doing a project in the downtown part of Kingston, in which the final project needed to be presented to the community. All right? Now they were involved in the process, but they were somehow subsumed because government was not that happy with getting too many community groups involved in the planning. So rather than present the work in drawings like one does work, or models or whatever it is, we took a 100-foot stretch of wall, and each of the ideas was then presented on the wall. The painting began on the wall, big, huge mural and so on. What was fascinating about that is that the wall and the mural was co-opted then by the community after a bit, in the sense that people would come up and they go, my house, no, my roof is not red, my roof is red, my roof is green. They take the paint and you paint it over again and so on. You've missed a tree out, missed a tree out. At the same time, there are kids fiddling on the bottom of the wall, painting little playgrounds and goodness knows what and so on. So the whole thing became a co-opted version, and adapted and embellished by the various groups that were actually in the community, insofar as what they really wanted, what was and what they really wanted. And that, of course, stayed as a clear documentation of the work, an interactive work and so on. Now again, we weren't working with artists. There were artists involved, right, in that whole process, because they came out as part of the mural activity. But what was fascinating was they mediated between the very practical work of getting some upgrading work done, water, sanitation, all the rest of it, and the more strategic agenda of making sure that there was ownership of the whole program, of that sort of thing. So, I just open up the debate. Really, I can give lots more examples, but I'd like to kind of just take the sort of practical and strategic. Equity is all about being strategic at the end of the day, because fundamental changes are required to bring equality. And equality, by the way, is often in history assumed is not about sameness. It's actually about the expression of differences. We all know that. That was not subsumed in the days of the wonderful public housing programs in different countries, where it was thought to make people equal, you make them all the same. And everyone expresses the same similarly, so that we're all equal. We now know that's absolute rubbish. So equity, efficiency, governance, which means partnerships, exploring new partnerships, which means participation, which means an expression of that, a representation of that in different ways. I have sort of three things that I work with, where I bring all of these ultimately to work with, and I was just in Sri Lanka recently doing the same thing. It always seems to me that has to ultimately find expression in new forms of organization. It has to ensure ownership, not just of the solution, but of the problem. And there has to be a way of doing what we do practically and strategically that accumulates assets. Social assets, what they call tangible and intangible assets. And actually, that's what the takeover bit is all about. That's where the real change is required. Governance that maintains the same organization, but pretends to bring people in to participate is a nonsense. So I don't know, let's just open up the debate, open up the discussion on, because I think there was in the questions, Carl, the question of governance, representation within different forms of governance, and so on. Oh, I should just say one final thing, which I think is important to the small change world and so on. We talk about communities, of course, all the time. And one of the real difficulties that I find when we're talking about engaging with civil society groups and getting representation is that the anthropologists will tell us, of course, that the word community is too homogeneous. There are communities of practice. This is a community of practice. We share certain things here. There are communities of culture, communities of place, because we share place. There are communities of resistance, which is an interesting one. And there are also communities of interest. We get together around a common interest. The kid's been knocked down, we mobilise and so on. The problem in cities is that the concept of community is mostly networked rather than place-based, which is why it's very difficult to actually get a commitment to place in a lot of community involvement work. But not only that, in cities, but also elsewhere, where is our commitment? I have a community culture that is networked, and yet I live in place A, but I also have a community of practice. I work with, I'm here, I have a real commitment here. But where do I build my sense of belonging, and where do I associate my commitment? And so when we're talking about good governance and representation, I will represent myself as a member of a community in different ways as to whether or not I'm discussing my background with my Muslim community or whatever it might be, versus my community of practice versus where I live. And I think that's a key one. And what was pointed out was that I find really interesting is that where the conflict really occurs is when you have a whole bundle of people living in a place that actually share the concept of community elsewhere. We see that most stringently in my work in refugee camps, for example, or places where communities have been displaced post-tsunami and that sort of thing. So we need to be sensitive to the word, obviously, I'm just telling you what you know, but to the word community when we're trying to engage with it or find a representation for it, self or with it and so on. Open up the discussion really. What is representation when it comes to the concept of governance? How do we bring practical and strategic work together in the concept of governance? And how do we find expression for that? I find interesting these examples we've seen here, that there's been a tremendous amount of intervention. And the real difficulty, of course, is building on that intervention more strategically. Long-term change involving government and so on. And I think one of the real reasons for that is that we've got to engage, I come back to what I started, which we've got to engage with the current political environment. And that is that it's got to be all about increasing efficiency and improving equality. And I think it was Tony Judge, the historian, once said, inequality is not just morally wrong, it's also inefficient, because you're not actually tapping the resource that may be there, but it's not being tapped because of discrimination, various kinds of discrimination, gender, age, ethnicity, or whatever it might be.